Day. He wrote 3 books with a very old soldier who is now 99 years old and saw frontline action in many battles in the Second World War. Rick's most recent book is about the women who were parachuted, the incredibly brave women who were parachuted behind enemy lines into France, and that is called Lonely Courage. But today, he's here to talk to you about an extraordinary bit of the Second World War. His book, The Phantom Army of Alamein, and it is about a crew of people who changed the fortunes of one part of the Second World War. So perhaps, Rick, we could begin by you telling us who these people were in what was called the camouflage unit.
Yes, and before I do that, Alexandra, could you pass me the clicker?
Yes.
Thank you. The camouflage unit was a group of men who weren't really soldiers. They were artists, film technicians, cameramen. There was even a magician. And they, instead of using guns and weapons to fight the war, they used their minds, their creative ability. And their job was to, first of all, to hide things from the enemy. And then their job became to deceive the enemy. And that was a much bigger thing. And it helped lead to victory at the Battle of El Alamein, where there were a lot of Indian troops. Alex?
So tell us about the Indian Army. How were they involved?
Well, just before I do that, I'd just like to give you a bit of history about the about camouflage. Camouflage is a very ancient art. There are cave paintings which are 20,000 years old, which show what we believe are men disguised as animals, which we think help them to move amongst the herd and to capture them, and also to exert magic on the over the animals in order to help to hunt them. The camouflage, as we know it, began in about 1845 with a corps of guides, which was made up of Sikhs, Pathans, Afghans, and they wore, in 1845, they wore casual clothes which had been dyed with mud. And that mud, that color, the muddy color, made them almost invisible to see, and that became called khaki, and that's what soldiers ended up wearing. Up to that point, they'd worn very, very bright colors, and these guides could blend into the landscape. Camouflage sort of first came to fruition in the First World War, and at the end of the First World War, there were 2 major camouflage attempts, one by the Germans and one by the British, and in both cases, they disguised what the army was doing. They disguised a big attack, and they even pretended that on the day of the attack, the British Army officers were all going to the races so that the Germans would have no idea what was going to happen, and that led to an enormous victory in Palestine. And General Wavell, who was in charge of the 8th Army during the Battle of Alamein, or before the Battle of Alamein, said the battle was fought, the battle was won before a shot was fired, and that shows just how important camouflage was.
And was dazzle a part of the camouflage?
Yeah, and that dazzle was a naval camouflage where ships were painted in very, very bright black and white stripes, and that helped to hide them. And as I said, there was a big Indian element at the Battle of El Alamein. India had one of the largest standing armies in the world. They were experienced fighters. They'd fought in the Third Afghan War, and at Alamein, where deception was a very, very big part of what happened, the Indian divisions attacked a sort of feinting attack into the center of the Alamein line, which I'll explain later, to help deceive Rommel as to where the real attack was going to take place.
So tell us a bit about the camouflage unit and how it was recruited.
In World War I, there was a guy called Freddie Beddington who'd been a sniper, and he was very good at hiding himself. He could crawl out into no man's land and spend not hours but days there. And he was a very successful sniper, and he had very developed ideas about how you hide yourself. At the end of the war, the First World War, the idea of camouflage was largely forgotten. Nobody knew how to do it, but somebody remembered Freddie and said, let's get him and we'll make him head of camouflage for the British Expeditionary Force. And it so happened that Freddie's brother worked for British Petroleum, and British Petroleum employed a lot of artists to paint posters, and Freddie went to see his brother and said, can you put me in the, can you introduce me to these artists, which he did. And so Freddie began to recruit the first artists. He went to the Royal College of Art, he went to the art schools, he went to the film studios, he went to the theatres to do the recruiting. And one of the people that he recruited was a magician called Jasper Maskelyne. Another man that he recruited was Roland Penfold. I'm just going to... Roland was a friend of Picasso, and they tried to make the idea... Pretty ordinary soldiers thought that camouflage was just a question of sticking a few twigs in your hat, and that would be it. And they tried to show them that if you didn't pay really serious attention to camouflage, the enemy would see you, and the result of that would be that you were killed. And in order to make it more exciting and more interesting, they printed and distributed a lot of pamphlets and books. And one of the things that Penrose did was to take his wife, who was the photographer Lee Miller. He stripped her naked. He wiped her body with what was called camouflage cream, which was brown and green, and covered the sort of vital parts of her body with grass, took a photograph of her lying on the grass, and distributed it to the troops to say, that's how you can camouflage yourself. It's a sort of graphic and ridiculous way to do it. He wrote the book that was just on the screen just now. I don't know whether it's possible to go back to that slide. Can you go back? No, you can't. And he said, camouflage is no mystery and no joke. It is a matter of life and death, of victory and defeat. And that's what it was. It wasn't just a question of, as I say, sticking a bit of netting over you. Get it wrong, the enemy would see you, and the next thing you know, you've been blown to pieces.
So when and where was the camouflage unit first used?
It was first used in England when they went around trying to brief military units on the necessity to use camouflage, and their biggest effort was that they devised and built several dummy airfields with lights, and they even created sort of small villages nearby to deceive enemy bombers into thinking that they were bombing an airfield when in fact all they were bombing was grass. And then they were sent to the Western Desert, and they were sent under the command of a failed film director called Geoffrey Barkas. Geoffrey was a very clever man. He'd had bad luck in his career and never been as successful as he wanted, but he saw the desert, and first of all he thought, this is just not going to be possible. How on earth can we hide ourselves in this great empty, barren expanse? But he took a lot of time to fly over the desert, and he realized that there were forms and places and things that you could use, and he slowly developed techniques for hiding lorries, troops, tanks, buildings, etc., etc. Rommel was also into deception and camouflage, and when he arrived in the Western Desert, he made his tanks unload, and he knew he had a limited number of tanks, and he wanted to make the British think that he had more. So he got his tanks to drive off down the streets of Tripoli, where he was landing, round the block, and to come round again. So there seemed to be an endless supply of tanks. And one British officer watching film of this suddenly said, I've seen that tank before, and realized that there was a tank with a particular marking on that had gone past about 3 times. But the fact that Rommel was so keen on it shows how important it was. Rommel's first thing was to besiege the city of Tobruk, which is a very, very important part. And the camouflage unit there swung into action to try and hide things in Tobruk. And they had nothing to work with. There was no world in which troop ships, which had to be full of troops and ammunition, could have camouflage materials put on them. So they scrounged them from wherever they could find them. And just to give you an idea of the scale, I've jotted down some of the quantities, and they had 8,000 tons of paint, 2.5 million yards of string, 125 million yards of 3mm cotton strip, and 500,000 yards of unbleached calico. And they would use these things to make structures which could hide things. And the first thing they did was to use the ships that had been sunk in Tobruk Harbour, which is that thing there. It doesn't really make that much sense, but they would take incoming ships and they would hide them inside the hulls of ships that had been sunk, and they'd hide stores inside the hulls of other ships that had been sunk. They'd stretch nets over that so that from the air you couldn't see what was coming in. They even did some very simple things. That one of the there was a particular place which was being heavily shelled, and they got a piece of hessian about as high as this room, and they stretched it for about 400 or 500 yards, and that hid from the enemy gunners the thing they were trying to shell, and that was very, very successful. And every time the enemy gunners destroyed the hessian screen, they just rebuilt it. The most impressive thing is this. This is a desalination plant, and it was very, very important. It was the only desalination plant they had inside the city of Tobruk, and it was very important that it wasn't damaged. So one of the camouflage officers within Tobruk said, "I know what we'll do. We'll wait till the Germans have carried out a bombing raid, and then we will disguise the desalination plant to make it look as though it has been bombed." And so they waited for a raid. The raid came. They had all the materials in place, and they painted the roof of the camouflage of the desalination plant in black. They put rubble all around it. They had vehicles which they could set fire to, old vehicles that had already been blown up. And from 1,000 yards in the air, or 1,000 feet in the air, that looked as though the desalination plant had been bombed, and therefore there was no more point in wasting ammunition on it, no more point in trying to bomb it. And there was a report in a German newspaper and an Italian newspaper in Rome that said, "Desalination plant in Tobruk destroyed, Axis victory." So it was a very, very, very successful piece of work. And slightly amusingly, this is a typical Akat gun that doesn't look from the ground very realistic. But if you look at it again from a height or from 1,000 yards away, it does look real. But one German bomber crew knew that this particular gun wasn't real. And one night they bombed it, and they bombed it with a wooden bomb just to show that they could enjoy a joke. Whilst this was going on, the magician that had been hired was trying to use magic, and he was a man who was a third-generation magician. His father and his grandfather had been very successful. He was called Jasper Maskelyne, and he tried to invent a light to dazzle the German bombers. That didn't work. He claimed after the war that he'd moved the harbour at Alexandria. That turned out to be a complete lie, but he did develop an anti-fire cream, which he put on, and he demonstrated. He'd caused fires to be lit, old crashed aeroplanes to be set fire to. Senior officers came to look at it. It did work. He could walk into the fires, but what he hadn't sort of taken into account, that if you're in a crashing bomber or a blazing tank, you haven't got the time to smear yourself in the anti-fire cream. So eventually he was sent home and was used to entertain the troops. The biggest part of the first real deception came when the British Army wanted to hide a huge railway siding that they'd made, and they said to the camouflage unit, "So how can you do that?" And they all scratched their heads and they said, "Well, we can't really hide it, but what we can do is make a decoy one." So they built a 10-mile long decoy railway siding, complete with trains and railway lines, and they made it all out of flattened tin cans, of which there were millions and millions in the desert, and they put little scarecrow figures to look as though they were guarding it, and they moved the scarecrow figures around at night, and if the place was bombed, they would then set off fires to make it look as though the bombing had been successful. And that was the first huge deception effort in the desert. The port of Tobruk fell, Rommel won, and then Singapore fell. Churchill was with Roosevelt when he heard this, and he was absolutely dismayed. And he said, "Defeat is one thing, disgrace is another." And he was furious. And the British Army was now in retreat, and it retreated all the way back to the Alamein line. It looked as though the Germans were getting to Cairo. It was rumored that Rommel had booked the best rooms in Cairo for his headquarters. The army was very, very demoralized. And then Montgomery appeared, and Montgomery said, no more retreating. We're going to knock Rommel for 6. He trained his troops. He was very effective. There's quite a lot of criticism of Montgomery, which I think is justified, but he was good, and he had this idea of a thing called binge. He wanted everybody to be full of binge, and that meant having an aggressive, attacking mentality. And whilst he was getting ready for what he knew would be the Battle of Alamein, because the British Army had held the line from Alamein, which stretched from the coast down to the Guataro Depression. Rommel had run out of petrol and was stalled, and I've done a rather ropey map. That ropey map, because I lost the good one that was in the book, shows the battle of the Alamein line is going horizontally across the picture, and what Montgomery wanted to do was to make it look as though the attack, he was going to attack in the north of the line where it says C, and he wanted to make it look as though the attack would come in the south of the line. And the camouflage unit were tasked to do this, and he said, what can you do? And they said, right, what we can do is we can create 2 divisions with a lot of men of artificial stuff, complete with tanks, lorries, a 20,000-ton storage depot. And in order to make Rommel think that the attack was going to come later, they said, we will build a fuel line out of tin cans, and it will look as though, we'll build it in such a way as that it will look as though it's going to be completed a week after the real attack was meant to go in. And Montgomery said, that's great. And he said, how can you hide the real stores? And they found a huge area of trenches that had already been dug, concrete trenches that, when in the sun, were in deep shadow on one side, and they hid millions of gallons of fuel, ammunition, stuff in these trenches and in other places. So they built a dummy army to the south of the line, which included a double bluff, and the double bluff was that they created false 25-pounder field guns, and those false 25-pounder field guns, they made the enemy realize were false, so that on the day of the battle they would swap them with real field guns. The Germans would come charging towards what they thought was canvas, and they would be blown to bits by real 25-pounders firing a point-blank range over open sights. To the north of the Alamein line, where it says C, they said, what we'll do is we'll do a conjuring trick. And the conjuring trick was this, that near the enemy, say 2 miles from the enemy, were 7,000 soft-skinned vehicles. And way back, 5, 6, 7 miles away, were the hard-skinned vehicles, the tanks and that. So long as the tanks were that far away, the enemy knew that the attack wouldn't happen. And as long as they could see the lorries, they knew that the lorries were no harm. They were soft-skinned, that you could blow them to bits as easy as anything. So the camouflage unit had 28 days to get their act together, and what they did was they built hundreds of dummy tanks out of local materials. They were reeds and bamboo of the sort that you might see anywhere in the country around here. They built tanks like that, and they also put lorry tops over the real tanks. So, and the real tank, or these the things that would go over the tanks were taken up to the lines where the lorries were. So here are the lorries. There's where the battle's going to take place. Here are the lorries. The Germans are looking at the lorries and they're going, that's all right, that's perfectly all right, they're only lorries. Here are the tanks. The Germans are looking at the tanks and they go, that's all right. Their tanks are miles away, they can't do any harm where they are. And then on the night before the battle, the troops were moved up into their defensive positions and forbidden to move, to make any noise, or do anything that would attract the enemy. And that's 200,000 men who are now waiting to cross the minefields. And that night, the tanks were driven to where the lorries were driven to where the tanks had been and out of sight. Dummy tanks were put where the real tanks had been, and the real tanks, which are now here, waiting to attack there, had these skins put on them. And this little diagram gives a rough idea of how complicated it all was. So the Germans woke up. Everything looked at 1,000 yards exactly as it had looked. And then the barrage went off. It's actually before dawn. The biggest barrage that had ever been seen in the history of warfare tore into the Germans. The tanks threw off their camouflage, and the attack went piling in. And the Rommel, who was the commander-in-chief of the German army, was in Germany seeing Hitler and having his birthday party, and he couldn't get there. The second in command was a man called General Stumm, and he said, I think this is a false attack. I think it's just to fool us. He said, I know that the real attack is going to come in the south, where the whole dummy army had been built, and I know that it's not going to happen for another week because that pipeline they're building hasn't been finished yet, so they haven't got any fuel ready to supply the tanks. And his officer said, General, please don't go. He said, no, I insist. This is a dummy. And he drove straight to the front line to inspect the damage that had been done. And 4 hours later, he was dead. And a few hours after that, another major German general was captured, who we think was actually trying to either die on the battlefield or be captured so that he could negotiate a surrender. And it took 3 days for Rommel to arrive in the Western Desert. And it took 3 days for the Germans to realize what was happening. Men were killed on both sides, but the attack did go forwards and had a terrific momentum which the Germans couldn't stop. So we'd broken out of the stalemate that had happened when Rommel had run out of fuel and we'd been thinking the Germans were going to beat us. Montgomery had been right, and soon after that the Americans joined the war, and the Allied armies, now with American personnel and material, swept through to Tripoli and swept the Germans out of North Africa. And so that the North African campaign was over, and we had won it. And it was largely due to the efforts of, the deception was due to the efforts of the men with paintbrushes and ideas and screwdrivers and sketch pads who had said, we'll make a whole phantom army, which is why I called my book The Phantom Army of Alamein. And all that was left at the end of the battle were little scarecrow men guarding canvas stores, left to sort of rot in the desert. And in November of that year, church bells rang out in England for the very, very first time, because it was the first major victory that the British, had, and it was a terrific boost to our morale. But the cost of it, in terms of blood and what's called in military terms the butcher's bill, was great. And I'd just like to end this brief talk, which I hope you've found interesting, by reading a little poem written by a young officer in the Desert Rats who'd fought at the Battle of Alamein. And he said, I rode my tank to Alamein, prepared to do or die. I led my few to victory. Now all I do is cry. And I think that shows you, in the bravado and the splendor and the glory and all the rest of it at war, there is a terrible and real reality and a terrible price to pay. And we can thank those men who fought in the tanks, and we can thank those men who fought not with tanks and rifles and bullets, but with paint and paintbrushes and hessian and string. And that's my tale. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rick.
And you're very reasonably priced. Makes a wonderful Christmas present. That's the book. Thank you very much indeed.
We wish to